Saturday afternoon. Maybe 2 p.m. The light coming through the window is that flat winter kind. Not warm, not dramatic, just there. You made something to eat. Nothing complicated. Eggs. Maybe. Or pasta, with whatever was in the cupboard. You didn't think about it much. You ate it standing at the counter, or sitting where you always sit, and when you finished you rinsed the plate, and that was the whole event. No one knew you ate. No one needed to. The apartment or the house, or the condo with the HOA that keeps sending passive-aggressive letters is quiet in a specific way. Not the quiet of waiting. Not the quiet of something missing. Just the ordinary silence of a space that is calibrated to exactly one person's presence. The podcast you had on earlier is off now. You turned it off deliberately. You didn't need it anymore. The TV is not on. It doesn't need to be. There is no background noise being used to fill anything, because there is nothing that needs filling. This is not a sad scene. It just looks like one from the outside. And that gap between what this looks like from the outside and what it actually is from the inside is the entire subject of what you're about to watch. There is a specific type of man who built a life that runs on a very different operating system than the one his generation was sold. He is not waiting to be rescued from his own existence. He is not performing stoicism while quietly falling apart. He is not a warning sign in a public health report, though he has appeared in a few. He is something that mainstream culture has never had an accurate vocabulary for a man whose interior architecture was built to spec, assembled deliberately over decades, tested under real conditions, and found to be entirely functional. The question this video is going to answer is not, what went wrong? Nothing went wrong. The question is, how did this specific internal structure get built? Where did the blueprint come from? What does the research actually say about men who live alone by design, not by accident, not by failure, but by a set of preferences that were laid down long before anyone thought to ask whether they were healthy? Because the psychology here goes back further than you might think. It goes back to a specific afternoon, in a specific decade, in a house that was also very quiet. That part comes later. Here is what the culture thinks it knows about this man. He is lonely. He is emotionally unavailable. He has commitment issues, which is a phrase invented by people who couldn't figure out why someone didn't want what they were offering. He is a cautionary tale about what happens to men who don't invest in relationships, cited in think pieces, referenced in health advisories, occasionally mentioned at family dinners, in a tone that lands somewhere between concern and judgment. The American Perspective Survey, conducted in 2023 by the Survey Center on American Life, found something that doesn't fit that story. Among men over 45 who lived alone, self-reported life satisfaction scores were not significantly lower than those of married men in the same age cohort. What did differ, significantly, was the source of that satisfaction. Men living alone reported it coming from autonomy, from the quality of their solitary time, and from a small number of high-trust relationships, not from daily social contact, and not from the presence of a partner. That is not the portrait of a man in quiet crisis. The University of Michigan's longitudinal data on adult well-being, drawn from a sample of over 4,000 men tracked across a 15-year period, found that the correlation between living alone and poor psychological outcomes virtually disappears when you control for one variable, whether the aloneness was chosen or imposed. Chosen solitude and involuntary isolation produce entirely different neurological and psychological profiles. The studies that treat them as the same thing are, to put it charitably, imprecise. He knows the difference. He has always known the difference. He just never had the data to say it out loud. The error was made early, and it was made consistently. And it shaped 3 decades of cultural assumptions that this man has been quietly living inside without asking to be there. In 1988, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services issued a report on social isolation that treated all forms of reduced social contact as equivalent threats to public health. The report was well-intentioned. It was also a category error of significant proportions. It made no meaningful distinction between a man who had been cut off from community against his will and a man who had structured his life around selective, intentional solitude. Both appeared in the same data, both got the same label. Then came Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, published in 2000, which argued that America's civic and social fabric was unraveling. The book was widely cited, widely read, and widely misunderstood. What Putnam actually documented was a decline in institutional participation bowling leagues, Rotary clubs, PTA meetings. What the popular press heard was, men who opt out of group activities are symptoms of social collapse. The man who preferred a quiet Saturday to a neighborhood barbecue became, in the cultural reading of that book, evidence of something broken. He was not evidence of something broken, he was evidence of something different. The wellness industry continued the project through the 2000s and 2010s, producing a steady output of content about male emotional unavailability, the loneliness epidemic, and the particular tragedy of men who don't talk about their feelings. Each of these narratives operated from the same foundational assumption that the interior life of a man living alone is, by definition, impoverished. The research doesn't support that conclusion. But the research requires more nuance than a headline, and nuance has never been the wellness industry's strong suit. What got labeled as dysfunction was, in many cases, design. Go back to 1978, or 1979, or 1981. Pick a year in that range, they all look roughly the same for the purposes of this story. It's about 3:30 inches the afternoon, school is out. You're 10, maybe 11. There is a key on a cord around your neck or in the front pocket of your toughskins, and it belongs to a house that is currently empty. Your mother is at work. Your father is at work. This was not a crisis. This was Tuesday. You let yourself in. The house had a specific smell when it was empty, slightly different from the smell it had when people were in it. Though you couldn't have explained the difference then. You dropped your backpack somewhere. You made yourself something to eat, cereal, maybe. Or a cheese sandwich, constructed with the particular resourcefulness of a child who has learned that no one is coming to make it for him. You turned on the TV. Or you didn't. You did your homework. Or you didn't. You existed in that space, alone, for 2 or 3 hours, and the world did not end. This was the experience of somewhere between 2 and 7 million American children during the late 1970s and early 1980s, according to U.S. Census data collected in 1984. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had documented the shift a few years earlier. By 1980, more than half of all American mothers with school-age children were working full-time. The social infrastructure to absorb those children after school had not yet been built, so the children absorbed themselves. Dr. Lynette Long, a developmental psychologist at American University, spent much of the 1980s studying these children. What she found was not primarily a story of neglect or harm. It was a story of accelerated autonomy. Children who regularly manage their own after-school time develop stronger self-regulation, higher tolerance for solitude, and a more internally located sense of competence than children who came home to supervised environments. They didn't just survive the empty house. They learned it. They learned the rhythms of it, the textures of it, the particular freedom of a space that belonged to no agenda but their own. They became, by necessity and then by preference, the architects of their own interior time. 40 years later, that skill looks like a man making eggs on a Saturday afternoon and feeling no particular need for it to be anything other than what it is. The science on solitude has a credibility problem that has nothing to do with the science. The problem is that most people only encounter the research on loneliness, which is genuinely dangerous, genuinely harmful, and genuinely worth taking seriously, and assume it applies to men who live alone by choice. It doesn't. And the researchers who study solitude specifically have been making this distinction for years, to an audience considerably smaller than the one reading loneliness think pieces. Dr. Netta Weinstein, a psychologist at the University of Reading, published research in 2022 examining voluntary solitude in middle-aged adults. Her study, involving 178 participants tracked across multiple weeks, measured cortisol reactivity, a direct biological marker of stress response in subjects who sought out time alone versus subjects who had time alone imposed on them. The findings were unambiguous. Voluntary solitude was associated with significantly lower cortisol reactivity to social stressors. In plain terms, men who chose to be alone had bodies that handled social friction better than men who had aloneness thrust upon them. The choice itself was protective. Dr. Esther Buchholz, a developmental psychologist and psychoanalyst, spent her career making an argument that the mainstream mental health field found inconvenient. In her 1997 book, The Call of Solitude, she proposed that the need for aloneness is not a pathology to be treated, but a developmental requirement as fundamental to psychological health as the need for attachment. She argued that Western psychology had built an entire theoretical framework around connection and belonging while almost entirely ignoring the equally real human need for solitary restoration. The field had, in her view, one eye closed. Then there is the Harvard study of adult development, which has been running since 1938 and is one of the longest longitudinal studies of adult psychology ever conducted. When researchers published findings from the cohort that included Gen X participants in 2015, they documented something important. Subjective loneliness and objective social contact frequency are weakly correlated at best. What mattered was not how often a man saw people. What mattered was how connected he felt to the relationships he did have. A man who spoke to 3 people regularly, but felt deeply known by those 3 people, reported higher well-being than a man surrounded by acquaintances. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo, whose work on loneliness is the most cited in the field, was careful about this distinction in his later research. His 2008 book Loneliness specifically identified perceived isolation, the subjective feeling of being unseen, as the variable that produces harmful outcomes, not the objective fact of living alone. He was explicit. Solitary living is not loneliness. They share a postal code on the cultural map, but they are not the same address. The man sitting with his eggs on a Saturday is not in Cacioppo's data. He was never in Cacioppo's data. He just got included in the popular summary of it, which is a different and considerably less careful document. There is a state that doesn't have a widely used name, which is part of why it keeps getting misread. Call it sovereign solitude. It is not loneliness. Loneliness is the experience of unwanted absence, a gap between the connection you have and the connection you want. Sovereign solitude is the opposite structure. It is not a gap, it is a domain. A self-governed interior territory with its own rules, its own rhythms, and its own logic. And critically, a logic that other people's presence would actively disrupt rather than improve. The man who lives in this state is not waiting for his life to begin. He is not enduring solitude while hoping for rescue. He has built something, a highly specific set of conditions under which he functions at full capacity, and he is living inside it. The solitude is not the setting, it is the architecture. This is distinct from hermitage, which has ideologically driven a withdrawal from the world on principle. It is distinct from depression, which flattens rather than sharpens. And it is distinct from the simple fact of being single, which is a legal status, not a psychological one. Sovereign solitude is earned. It is available only to someone who has spent enough time alone to learn, with some precision, who he actually is when no performance is required. Most people never find out. The man who came home to an empty house at 10 years old started finding out earlier than most, and he has had 4 decades to refine the knowledge. The key around his neck wasn't just a way into the house. It was, in retrospect, a way into himself. Access to a version of his own mind that existed only in the absence of other people's expectations. Sovereign solitude. That is what this is. It is worth having a name for it. Here is what people miss. The man who lives in sovereign solitude is not without care, or connection, or a form of intimacy that is real and specific, and occasionally more durable than the kind that announces itself. He just expresses it in a register that mainstream culture has consistently failed to read correctly. Developmental psychology has a useful distinction here. Face-to-face intimacy versus shoulder-to-shoulder intimacy. Face-to-face is the kind that involves direct eye contact, explicit emotional language, the full vocabulary of declared feeling. Shoulder-to-shoulder is different. It is the intimacy of proximity and parallel activity, 2 people next to each other doing something, not talking about their feelings, but simply being present in the same space toward the same purpose. Research on male bonding behavior, including primatological work by Robin Dunbar at Oxford on how men sustain close relationships, consistently finds that shoulder-to-shoulder interaction is the primary mechanism by which men build and maintain trust. This man has people. He just has them on specific terms. There is a friend he has not seen in 14 months, who would, without question, be at his door within 4 hours if the call came. There is a brother he texts approximately 6 times a year, but whose address he knows by memory. There is someone whose car he helped move in 2019, and who he has not spoken to since, but for whom he would show up again with the same absence of ceremony. These are not failed relationships. They are a different grammar of relationship, lower in frequency, higher in reliability, stripped of the maintenance labor that he finds exhausting and that he has never quite believed was necessary. The care is not absent. It is stored differently. Take each label, one at a time, and look at what is actually underneath. Withdrawn. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is, from the inside, selectivity. It is the output of a man who has run enough social experiments over enough decades to have a reasonably accurate model of which situations produce something worth having and which ones produce noise. He is not hiding, he is filtering. Those are not the same operation. And the fact that culture treats them as equivalent says more about culture's preference for gregariousness than it does about the relative value of what is being filtered out. Emotionally unavailable. What looks like emotional unavailability is, more precisely, economy. A man who does not perform emotion for an audience, who does not narrate his internal states as they occur, who has decided at some point in his 40s that not every feeling requires a witness. That man is not unavailable. He has simply stopped producing emotional content for consumption by people who are not going to do anything useful with it anyway. Unable to sustain relationships. What looks like an inability to sustain relationships is, under closer examination, an intolerance for relationships that require him to perform a version of himself he no longer recognizes. He can sustain plenty of things. He has sustained a career, a set of competencies, a home, a life with actual texture and continuity. What he cannot sustain is the performance of neediness he does not feel, or warmth he does not have access to on command, or the ongoing social labor of managing other people's comfort with who he is. Brian Little, a personality psychologist at Cambridge, argued in his 2014 book Me, Myself and Us that for certain personality profiles, particularly those he called high self-monitors in low-demand environments, solitary living genuinely produces better psychological outcomes than shared living. Not equal outcomes, better ones. The environment is load-bearing. Remove the load, and the structure stands taller. The man who built a life calibrated to his own frequency didn't fail at the standard model. He found a different one that fits the actual specifications. That is not damage. That is engineering. Saturday afternoon. The same light, the same quiet. He ate. He rinsed the plate. He sat where he always sits, or he stood at the window for a few minutes, looking at nothing in particular, and then he went back to whatever he was doing. No one knew about any of it. There was no one who needed to. There is a version of this scene that is a tragedy. A man alone in a quiet house, the years accumulating around him. A life that looks from the outside like something reduced. That version exists in a lot of cultural narratives. It shows up in health reports and think pieces and worried conversations at family dinners. There is another version. A boy, maybe 10 years old, turns a key in a front door and steps into a house that is empty and silent and entirely his. He figures out how to inhabit it. He figures out what he is like when no one is watching and nothing is required of him. He builds something in there, a set of internal conditions, a kind of quiet sovereignty, and he never really stops building. 40 years later, the house is still quiet. He built it that way. If this framing of sovereign solitude landed for you, if something in this video names something you've been carrying around without a label for it, there is a next video in this series. It covers how Gen X men maintain identity over time when that identity was built in solitude rather than in relation to other people. Same register, same approach to the research. You already know whether this was worth your time. You don't need to be asked. The key was always yours.